Welcome to Art, Life, and Pixels. Hello, welcome to the third installment of my abstract mini painting series. It's a series on paper. If you haven't seen the first and second episode, I encourage you to do so and come back to this one. Now, this time I wanted to film a little intro to the video for two reasons. I thought it was a good idea, basically, to have me introduce what's going to happen in the video. Fantastic. The second reason is because I encountered a bit of a technical issue. No, it was a human issue, and that human was me. After setting up my overhead camera, making sure everything was within the frame, I started filming and I did my work, and I spent, I guess, almost an hour working on these 6 mini paintings. But you know, the reality is my head was in the frame too. Not the entire time, but a significant portion of the footage that I filmed yesterday had my head in front of my work as I was doing it. Not ideal. So I was left with two options: either scrap the footage, but I couldn't really do that because I can't undo what I've already done. So I decided to go ahead, and I went through the entire time editing out the portions where I'm hiding the work that I'm doing. Does it end up messing up the flow? Kinda, sort of. I had to take away all my audio, and I decided to do a voiceover, which is fine because I'll be able to explain my process as I'm going through the footage. I hope you enjoy the video, despite its choppiness, I guess. It's disappointing, but it's better than not trying, right? I'm learning. I'm confirming there is going to be a part 4, and that will be the final episode. Let's get on with the video. Just a small mention, what you will see me do on screen versus what I will be speaking about will not necessarily line up. I will refer to techniques that I have used throughout the video, but they don't necessarily happen at that same moment. Hello, I'm back here looking at these 6 mini paintings. I've got them all in my hand right now and judging what I should or how I should go forward. And the best approach, I think, in this case for me is to not think about them as 6 mini paintings. And that was probably part of the procrastination that I was feeling, or at least the fear going into this third episode. And so I decide to separate them out into 2 sets, to work on them in 2 sets of 3. They're more digestible in my head in that sense. So I try to make a selection of the ones that best suit the style, I guess. I'm trying to think of the overall series because they do need to relate to each other. So I can't lose track of that concept. It's very important to keep that in mind. Hence why sometimes I get a little bit overwhelmed when I'm working on multiple pieces. With all that said, I need to make some sort of selection. I have to admit, sometimes working intuitively can be intimidating because you're not coming from the standpoint of having something that you're representing. It doesn't need to look like anything. It needs to represent an emotion, a feeling, something that you want to project from within. So that's where the big challenge sits. I know that I cannot go back to how I felt then, because then was then, now is now. At this point, all I can do is truly try to connect with what's happening in that particular moment and make the selections for the two separate sets based on my intuition, based on how I feel about them. Is there some sort of reaction that I can identify that will set that one apart from the next? Because I'm going to touch them all today. I'm going to work on all of them. It's just a matter of which one says, pick me first. And I think that's sort of fun, but it also speaks to just start. And I need to trust that more. I think as artists, we all need to trust that part of our gut and just start. But before I start, I needed to also identify something that was missing in my second part. The paints that I used, I had identified in my first episode. And when I did the second episode, I used a lot of my colors, except for some reason, I omitted the Payne's Gray. I think it's probably the reason why I got sort of stuck, which meant that I couldn't pull it together as well as I could have. And that's okay. We have an opportunity in this episode to bring that darker value back. And I'm not only going to bring back the Payne's Gray in paint form, but I'm also going to bring it back in a wax crayon form. So using the Caran d'Ache Neo Color ones, which are the non-water soluble ones. They're the more waxy ones. So once you put it down, it pretty much stays put, which is why I love to use them in my work. I tend to use them to make marks, obviously, but I also use them to accentuate paint marks. So as you're putting layers down, that adds different ridges on your paper. So the Caran d'Ache, as I scrape them on top in a sort of wider sense, not in a pointy sense. If I scrape the surface of the paint with them, they tend to pick up on the ridges, adding some of the wax and skipping the lower parts or the parts that are closer to the paper. And this adds a tremendous amount of texture. And I tend to add color that way without adding a concentration of color. It just adds interest to the work in general. With that in mind, I went to my Neo Color One stash of different colors and added, obviously, the Payne's Gray. I also added yellow ochre, Sahara yellow as my white or my light value. I added raw sienna, and olive green comes in, and olive green light, I believe, also comes in. They were difficult to identify because the papers, I had taken them off, so I'm guessing at those two olive greens. Now, the way I enjoy using the Neo colors, as I said before, take the paper off and use the wide end to scrape along the top. So the way I usually do this is not in a very bitty sort of way. I kind of try to do it in a very gestural way. And it's the same thing for the mark making. I try to use marks that don't make any sense, that are more like akin to scribbles, because I know that they will add interest and they will largely be covered up depending on the subsequent layers. During the footage, you will see me doing these gestures. Although I'll call them grand, they're grand for the size of the paintings, but in general, they're going to be as grand as they can be within the scope and the size of the mini paintings are. That makes sense. The next thing that you will see me working with is my paint shaper, color shaper. People call it different things, to apply paint. I think I like using the color shaper because it also scrapes the surface of the paint ridges, but it does this in a much smoother way. So if you take the Caran d'Ache crayon, that leaves wax behind. But in the case of the paint shaper, it glides on the surface, picks up the ridges, but leaves behind a smoother texture. I truly believe that using this kind of smooth and rough texture adds to any painting. And I like that contrast. I think it's effective. Now, the other reason why I like using a paint shaper or color shaper is because it's unpredictable. You don't know what you're going to get, especially because I get the paint straight from the tube and put it onto the shaper. So the effect will be different if you put a lot of paint on the shaper or a little bit of paint on the shaper. It depends on what you're looking for. I know for myself, my personal preference is that if I see that I have a color that's quite strong, opaque, and needs to be pushed back a bit, I usually use a transparent coordinating color, or it could even be complementary. All that to say that it knocks it back and it calms it down, which is what I was looking for. Pushing any strong opaque colors towards the back gives your piece additional dimension, and that's a good thing. Something else that you will see me using in conjunction with the color shaper is my water bottle. Now, the water bottle helps loosen up some of the paint that I'm applying with the color shaper. This technique adds a watercolor quality to the paint, and you can further use your color shaper to move this watercolory paint. What I tried to do as well is use this watery effect and twist the color shaper. Created these ribbon-like effects, which I kept, but for obvious reasons left it alone so that it would dry, because at this point I had a lot of water, and it's best to do that, especially if you want to hold on to the effect or the shape that you have created. It's best to just leave it alone for a bit. Now, as you're seeing on screen, that I have used a cut up mat board to frame some of the work. And I think it's a very effective tool to show you, or at least give you an idea where your work is going, and more specifically, where maybe you need to take the work. Maybe your piece needs a little tweaking, a little detail. This kind of objective look, when you take it into Photoshop, is a perfect example or a perfect opportunity to make those changes. And in particular for this video, I wanted to show you each of the 6 mini paintings in their frames as they stand as we end this video. So stay tuned for episode 4 soon. And most of all, I hope this video was insightful, helpful, and that it provided you with some hints, tips, things you wouldn't have known otherwise. And on that, I will see you soon. Thank you so very much for watching the video. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment. It helps the channel, it helps me, and it's totally free.